All right, I'm hitting broadcast now.
Good afternoon, all. Thank you for joining us. My name is Greg Morris. We're just going to give it 1 or 2 minutes for a number of people to join us, and we'll kick off in approximately 2 minutes' time. Thank you. So good afternoon again, folks. My name is Greg Morris. I'm the Customer Executive for NAB Private, based here in Sydney. And thank you for joining us today on this webinar. Tuning in, we have clients from across NAB Private and NAB Health, from right across Australia. And these are truly extraordinary times that we're living through at present. And I do thank you so much for taking the time to join our webinar today and to take the opportunity to be better informed and to obviously learn from some of the insights that we're going to take from our Group Chief Economist, Alan Noster, today. May I also take the opportunity to thank the NAB Health customers on the phone on the webinar, especially the doctors and the pharmacists and the dentists and whatnot who are going through quite extraordinary times at present. And thank you for your service during these challenging times. Obviously, many business owners and individuals are facing very, very difficult decisions and are seeking guidance, support and reassurance in making those decisions. And we at both NAB Private and NAB Health are here to help you. And please do reach out to your bankers. Please reach out to any of the leadership and management team if we can help you in any way, or if you need to discuss your own affairs. Customers are reaching out looking for information. They're looking for insights. They're looking for direction and guidance during these difficult times. And in the past couple of weeks, we've had as many calls as we would have in a typical year from clients looking for direction and looking to have a chat about their own finances. And to that end, we've actually set up this teleconference today, or this webinar today, to have a discussion with our Group Chief Economist, Alan Noster, to help share NAB's views on the economy what is happening, the macroeconomic situation, both domestically here in Australia, as well as internationally, as well as discuss both the banks and the government's stimulus packages and how they're going to play out to support the economy. He'll also hopefully share his view on what any economic recovery might look like and when that might kick off. I'd also like to take the opportunity to introduce my co-host, Kate Galvin, the customer executive from NAB Health, who you will hear from later on in this presentation. We have a hard close at 1:50, and we have allocated somewhere in the region of 20 minutes for Alan to discuss his views, and we're going to run through some of the questions that have been asked of us before the webinar, but also any questions that you wish to raise during this. We do have a tab, a Q&A tab, which feel free to jot your questions down and we'll try to capture them, and if we have time, we'll put them to Alan for his answer. So without further ado, I will pass over to my colleague, Alan Oster, who hopefully is on the line.
Yep.
Perfect. And Alan, obviously, you're a man in demand at the minute. Everybody's looking to have a chat with you.
The honest answer is I wish I knew the answers to a lot of these questions. What I thought I might do is just start off by just saying a couple of things about where the globe is and then talk a little bit more about where we're seeing the domestic economy. From the globe, and this is all about the virus, this is the close down and particularly the containment measures and what they do to the economy. So tomorrow we'll see Chinese GDP, and in the first quarter we're assuming it's down 16%, which means that China this year is probably not going to grow at all. Yes, it'll come back, but it won't grow. It'll be stronger next year. Then you look at the US, you look at the UK, they're sort of, and Europe, they've been hit more in about the June quarter. And, you know, you're talking -5s, -6s. And even in countries like India, you're only talking 1 to 2% growth. So you add it up and we get global growth subtracting or falling by about, we've got 2.8. I think the IMF came out and said -3. And put that in context, the previous all-time record flat period post-World War II was the GFC, where global growth was 0. So what you've got is a very different sort of global slowdown. It's very much about containment. The shape of the slowdown is very much a V. But one of the really different things about this slowdown is that it's going to have an impact on employment almost straight away. And so the IMF is right to say this is a recession the likes of which we haven't seen. It's going to be steeper, but it's also, depending on when the virus containment measures are sort of lifted, it's going to be more of a V-shaping growth. In level terms, that's a different issue. And this is also very true for Australia, that, you know, if you drop by about 6 or 7%, and then from that lower base you grow by 6 or 7%, you're actually not back to where you started. And in Australia, if I can then sort of move back to Australia, we don't think that you're going to get back to the level of growth that we had at the end of last year until mid-2022. So that has some really important ramifications in terms of unemployment. Now, what we know is what's happening now. So number one, we can look at our business surveys. Number two, we can look at our internal data, and I'm going to sort of share that sort of big picture with you. In terms of the business surveys, we were running surveys mid-February through to mid-March, and basically nothing much had happened. Then we ran a business survey at the end of March, and we got the worst results ever, full stop, ever. And that includes 1989 and the early 90s recession, both in terms of the steepness of the fall. So business confidence went from about +2 or around 0, let's call it. All-time record negative was -21, and we got a -66. You also got forward orders, capacity utilisation at levels that were worse than the bottom of the 1990 recession. Business conditions was not quite as bad, but it fell a lot. And it's probably going to get as to the bottom of the 1990 recession in the next couple of months. So one of the core things about this is that it's happened in the last 3 to 4 weeks. So a lot of the data is going to be hopeless in terms of the official data. So let me give you the example. This morning we put out a labour market number for March, which you would think is fine. That probably is going to reflect some of the big falls. Actually, it's taken the first 2 weeks of March. And so employment actually went up by 6,000, and unemployment, sure, it went from 5.1 to 5.2, whereas we think it's probably sitting at present around 7%. So that is number one in terms of what we're seeing. In terms of the internal data, we haven't published this and we're not allowed to, but hopefully pretty soon we're going to do a fortnightly update. So one of the things we can do is we can look at consumption, which includes health, it includes any service that's outside of retail, and then you add retail in. So retail is about a third of consumption, and the service sector is essentially 2/3. Up until early March, in fact, even into March, what we were seeing was these massive falls in things like hospitality, clubs and pubs, that sort of stuff. But the supermarkets were spending or selling more than they'd ever had. And even in March, there was one sector that went up in our business surveys called wholesale, because they've never had that much demand for their product. Mind you, they've also got the worst confidence as you go forward. What we're now seeing is retail flattening off. So you can buy toilet paper in the supermarkets, for example. And it's more than being now dragged down big time by what's happening elsewhere. And just give you some numbers to give you a feel. If hospitality, clubs and pubs were doing 100 last year, this year they're doing 30. So they've fallen 70%. If you look at high caps, which is our internal data in terms of allied health, it's down around 90%. And if you look more generally, what you see is it's getting worse each week. So we can run that data on the Tuesday or Wednesday for the week ending the Sunday. So we've got data like that. And we're sharing that with the government, and they're obviously very thankful, and we're going to do that. The other thing we can now do is we can look at the revenue that comes into the business bank clients. And we can do that by industry, we can do it by size. And it's taken a massive hit in April. So the sectors that are really badly, that were really badly hit are things like recreation, personal services, things like mining. We're not sure why are mining. We think it may have something to do with can't move people interstate, but it's having a big hit. We're seeing sectors such as, if you like, the personal business services being hit hard. We're seeing transport, i.e. you're not driving around as much. And we're now starting to see retail being hit as well. So we can see a very large, sharp recession coming through. And as I said, so what are we expecting? We're expecting maybe a small fall in the March quarter, although it could even be slightly positive. We're expecting a 7% fall in the June quarter, and we're expecting another 1% or so in the September quarter. So we've got about an 8.5% peak to trough fall during the course of this year. Now, I'm going to make an assumption. My assumption is that roughly life starts to return to normal by September. Pick a number out of the air, which means that December is better. It comes back really strongly. And so we get a 7% kick up if you like, in the 12 months to the September quarter next year. The problem is, like I was saying before, is the level of GDP is not going to be better than where it was last year until mid-22. So that's a really important thing to think about. The other thing is, when you get into recessions, traditionally, if they're driven by interest rates or global recessions, etc., people tend, initially anyway, to ignore it and just cut hours and that sort of thing. And unemployment is the last thing you cut. And so it normally takes about 2 years to get the peak in unemployment. And that's what happened in the 1990 recession. It peaked at about 11.5 at the end of 92. This recession, or this slowdown, is very different. People are basically closing businesses, and therefore they can't essentially keep people on. And so therefore you get a very quick reduction once you get past middle of March. We're all guessing. Now, the government spent about 10% of GDP trying to fix it, and half of that, or a bit more than half of that, was JobKeeper. And that, I think, is really good, except that the damage to some extent has already been done. What I think JobKeeper is going to do is rule out, hopefully, the idea of 15 to 20% unemployment. So the government's talked about 10% for the peak in a couple of months' time. We're at 11.5 or 11 and 3/4, but I can't tell the difference between 10 and 12, to be honest, in terms of a forecasting number. But the message is it's going to be strong. But hopefully we're going to go through the other side. A lot of this is going to depend on the virus. So you can do a scenario that says, hey, we can start reopening things in June, or we can start in September, or it's still going in the middle of next year, in which case I'm really worried. So we have unemployment going up. Because the level of GDP doesn't get back to where we were, we have an improvement in employment, but by the end of next year, we're still talking about something with a 7 in front of it in terms of unemployment. So we've got about 7.5 in our forecast. Because it will take time, and I think the government will be very careful to try and avoid what I might call phase 2 of a virus. And they're seeing signs of that in Singapore and China now, where you sort of thought you're over it and then suddenly come back a bit, and so they're closing things down again. I think the government is going to change the environment very, very cautiously. They might start on some things and do it in some regions, and then if everything's okay, broaden it. I think it'll take them a long time to essentially open up international travel. I don't expect anyone to be buying cruise ship holidays, but apparently they are. I think it might be rolling over ones that they'd previously booked, but those things are difficult. I think some sectors will be okay. I think other areas will be fundamentally changed. So if everybody, and we're all doing it working from home sort of thing on the Zoom, will you need commercial property as much as what you did in the past? And I think the short answer to that is probably not. You know, I think the last I saw, NAB's got 35,000 people, more than 30,000 of us are working from home. And we didn't think we had that technology about a month ago, but we do now. So does NAB needs 5 or 6 buildings in Melbourne? And what do you then do to people in the CBD? And so that sort of gives you sort of the feel. I think house prices are going to be under pressure. One of the issues that you've got is the population. Half the population growth comes from migration. And just at present, there ain't any, because they've closed down the airports. So that's going to put a bit of strain on. Normally, when unemployment gets above 8, you have an issue in relation to house prices. I think the banks are going to try and get over that, in the sense that they're very unlikely to foreclose unless you were sort of a basket case beforehand. But I think they'll be very generous in terms of what they do. And there's lots of loans for business. And, you know, we don't know how big the increase, but I've done some initial sort of numbers on business credit based on the applications we've had for our 250,000 loan. And you might see business credit growth up to 15%, where it was previously growing at about 2% in the next 6 months. So those things there's a lot of things out there. A couple of other things before I let you ask me questions is one of the dynamics that is difficult at present is how much money have you spent and is the debt too high? My answer to that is the debt is not too high. We started off at 18 to 19% debt to GDP. If we're up at 30 to 40, well, the world average is 90 and they're spending the same amount as we are. I think it's really critical to avoid the depth of the recession as much as you possibly can, and that's what the government's trying to do. There are some dynamics about when you open up, as I said before. There's also some dynamics that you probably haven't heard of, but from an economist's point of view, I worry about, and that is that I can't see wages growth picking up much. And in fact, I can see wages growth slowing to something like 1.25%, 1.5%. If I do that, inflation essentially disappears. And even if you had interest rates still at 0.25 in inflation adjusted terms, what we call real rates, currently the real rate's around about -1.5, and it'll probably be minus 0.5, 0.2 next year. So real rates go up. So as we come out, there will be these structural changes. And there'll also be this problem that rates are going to be higher. So I would not be at all surprised if the government has to do additional fiscal packages on the other side. If you think about a lot of the timing of the packages were for the next 3 to 6 months. And so when you get to the other side of that, what do you do to keep the economy going? Sure, you'll get a kick because you're starting to reopen it. But if interest rates are still high in real terms and some of the fiscal packages disappear, I think you'll need more money into the consumer. And that's difficult to see how that's going to happen. So I'm not trying to underplay the extent of this recession. I'm not trying to overplay it either. I mean, you can hear people say, oh, this is the worst. And they talk about as if it was the Great Depression. It's not the Great Depression. In the Great Depression, the government didn't do anything. It let banks fall over, et cetera, et cetera. It took 10 years. And the unemployment rate in Australia apparently got to 25%. But the speed and the damage that has been done by the virus in terms of closing down the parts of the economy will take a long time. I think Australia will do better than a lot of the countries. If nothing else, we haven't closed down as much as, say, Europe, China, the UK has done, and we're expecting growth rates in Europe and UK and the US somewhere around -6. So we're, quote, only -4. But that is different to anything we've seen before. And there's nothing much you can do about it now. And I don't think you want to really be relaxing the health areas just to try and get the economy going again. Because I think the government will be incredibly careful about second and third rounds. And if you go back to the Spanish flu, apparently it had 3 rounds coming through. So that's what you want to avoid. Everybody's thinking about how do we get out of this situation. And apparently New Zealand, we expect, is going to go from phase 4 to something closer to us. Still tougher than us, but at least they're going to hopefully open the bank branches. Hopefully it means you can now get a tradesman to come into your house. So there've been some really big impacts in New Zealand. So they're going to probably be in the -6 camp. So I actually think in some ways Australia's done well. I don't worry about the debt because we didn't have a lot to start with. I worry about the financial implications as you go through. Some sectors of the economy are absolutely being killed. And, you know, when you get someone doing 10% of the turnover or only 10% of the turnover in some health areas, that is difficult. And a lot of the sort of packages have been outside of JobKeeper trying to get credit and trying to get people through to the other side. And that's good, but a lot of people don't want the credit. And there are some technical issues as well. One of the technical issues with JobKeeper that nobody's talked about is if you're a small business, you can pay your employees now $1,500 a month, but you won't get recompensed by the government until the 1st of May. There's a nasty, and I suspect they're assuming that the banks will come and fund them, and we're happy to do that if you're a decent customer and if you haven't had problems in the past. But some people won't want to do that. Some people will say, well, look, I've got liquidity, I've got going out backwards. Do I really want more debt? So they're the sort of questions we're talking about. I think it's very scary times. But I'd sort of say don't panic, despite what I've just said. I think Australia is really well placed. I think there's some medium-term issues that are important in terms of what does this mean for population. We do podcasts internally for the staff, and one of the things I said to the staff this morning, if I'm looking around the world and I see Australia and we've had 60-something and it's an economy that looks pretty good, I still think a lot of people want to come and live here. And so that's a positive on the other side. So, Greg and Kate, I might stop there.
Perfect.
So you've got 20 minutes to ask me questions.
Yeah, no, perfect. Thank you for that. And I'm quite excited, Alan, because we've got a few questions already asked. For those joining us by via your iPad or via your computer or iPhone, you can ask questions using the Q&A tab at the top. And my apologies to my colleague Carolina, because I didn't make this clear at the outset. But we've actually got a few questions asked. But before we go there, Alan, I was reading first thing this morning the IMF report, which came out yesterday, and it was grimly titled "Great Lockdown: Worst Economic Downturn Since the Great Depression," which was obviously cheerful reading over my breakfast. Yes. And it talked about obviously Australia GDP due to fall by 6.7% this year, but expecting a quick recovery, which was an interesting outcome of that. One of the questions that's been asked by somebody before the webinar by email was, about how consumers are feeling and how you expect consumer choices and discretionary spends to be post this. And I think back to, early economics when I was in school, thinking about the paradox of thrift, which is also very good. People saving money, but suddenly everybody starts saving money and it becomes completely counterintuitive and counterproductive to what we're trying to achieve. What's your thoughts on how consumers might come out of this?
First thing I'll just say something, and that is I think the IMF's got Australian GDP wrong. I know the Treasurer's coming said that was before all the packages, but I find it very difficult to say that Australia, given that we haven't closed down sectors like construction, somehow ends up with the same fall as Europe and the UK. I just think that's very unlikely. Having said that, I don't think there's a consumer out there that basically isn't scared. And we had a consumer sentiment index that came out earlier this week, and it was the biggest fall for 45 years. All right, so they're all scared. I think if you want to use an alternative thing, if you talk to the health funds, apparently they've got a small boom going because nobody wants to go to hospital. Nobody's claiming. So you will get different effects. I think consumers will still want things that they think they have to have. So if I'm picking one sector, agri looks like it's going to be okay. It's one, you've got better. The drought's sort of, I won't say gone, but there's a lot of rain out there, and we're not sending things offshore anymore, and so agri's looking a lot better. But consumers still need food, and they would still like to go out and do things. That's to some extent stopped, particularly clubs, pubs, and things like that. I think they'll still want to do that once you live those areas. Now it may be the restaurants are only half full relative to their previous capacity. But I think the way the IMF and its reporting was written up was a bit to the dark side. Although I'm giving the same. I've got -2 and they got -3, which is not a lot. But to get a -6 in Australia, I think is a big ask in terms of negativity. And yep. You're right. This is worse than anything we've ever seen before in terms of the speed of the downturn. But even in 1990, the unemployment rate did get to 11.5. So maybe, we're just going to get it there in 3 months rather than a couple of years. So I think there'll still be demand for things. If you don't have a CBD office tower that's occupied, I feel sorry for some of the people who are situated to serve those tenants. And that sort of things are going to be difficult. And whether people will want to go into hospitals in the near term, I don't know. So that might have an impact as well.
Yeah, perfect. There have been a few questions asked around monetary and fiscal stimulus packages.
Yep.
So I'll try to roll all of these into one because, when I look at the Australian government, they've been very specific and targeted, or the RBA, sorry, rather than the government, around what they are buying. But then I look at the US, and in the last couple of days, we've seen they're buying everything, right? So they're starting to buy sub-investment grades, high yielding debt and whatnot. You're really opening Pandora's box there. But if we bring it back to Australia for a second, how long can this, in essence, quantitative easing and various stimulus packages continue? And what impact might it have for our credit rating?
I sort of don't care about the credit rating, to be brutally honest. They put us on negative watch and fine, but everybody else should be on step down as well. What the Reserve Bank is doing is it's buying bonds in the secondary market, and it's targeting the 3-year part of the curve. So what it's trying to do is what we call yield curve control. So it's trying to keep the price of money out to 3 years the same as the cash rate. They're not doing what the Fed is doing, which is I will buy whatever I need to. And so they've just said unlimited QE. And as you were saying, they've also now gone into municipal bonds and things like that. The RBA is saying, I want a target of 0.25 to 0.3 in the 3-year bond. And if I don't get it, I will buy the hell out of it. And they do get an announcement effect. So they don't have to spend as much as they have been spending. There has been some problems in semi-government spreads blowing out relatively. So the RBA has been buying some of them recently, and it's sort of settling. So for me, I think the RBA doesn't want to go for negative rates. They clearly don't. And I think what they're trying to do now is keeping liquidity going at a low price, allowing banks to borrow to fund some of these packages that they might otherwise not have been able to do, and government guarantees. But it's still a loan. So one of the things that we trying to tell the bankers is that whilst we're not asking you to pay any interest for the next 6 months, it capitalises and you still need to pay it back.
Yeah.
That's one of the issues. So for me, monetary policy is done about as much as it can. Fiscal policy, I think we're basically in the ball relative to everybody else. I think we were light on up until JobKeeper. And I think we'll probably do more. So the US has done basically 10%. They're talking about, well, Trump's talking about another 10%. And the Democrats are now talking about another 5%. I think we will need something on the other side to help us going once these targeted measures disappear. But I'm still happy with this. So if you told me that, we lose our credit rating and unemployment gets a 5 in front of it sooner as a result, I'll take that any day. Because unemployment is a lot of damage. And you will lose people with suicides than you will probably to the virus if you keep it on too long.
Yep, no, absolutely. And we saw obviously in Ireland during the time of the GFC, the suicide rate and mental health issues spike. So look, thank you. I'm going to pass over to my colleague, Kate Galvin, the customer executive from NAB Health. We've had a number of questions come in the live feed Q&A. I'm quite excited to hear what Kate has to ask you. So thank you.
Thank you, Greg. So Alan, I'll probably condense them down because the questions kind of have some thematics, some of them are specific, but they're kind of going to, and you're talking about the other side and the deep V, and we're hearing quite a lot of, not just you, but other sources talk about September. What are you basing your timeframes on?
I guess. We don't know. We really don't know. If you wanted to be optimistic, you could say, well, look, China's, okay, they let their economy fall 16% in the first quarter. That's what we'll find tomorrow. But they've it happened in January and they're finished in March. Now, 2 months from March is April, May.
Yeah.
I don't think Australia is going to be like that. I think what we're going to do is do phased. reductions. I wouldn't rule out the idea. And so we're looking at places like Korea to try and figure out, if you're further ahead of flattening the curve, how are they going to start? What are they going to do? I mean, you might take, I'll use Western Australia or something, as a particular area when you release thinking something and watch to see what happens for a month or two. I don't think you do international travel, but if you put your thinking hat on, you might resume international travel as long as it's just to New Zealand and here. Because I think they've got 8 or 9 people dead.
Yeah.
Got much higher restrictions than we do. So I just think people are going to be very cautious. Obviously, the government's now looking for what happens on the other side and what do I do and you know, I've been on a couple of videos already today or Zoom meetings already today with the Treasury and the industry departments where they're trying to say, well, who's really hurting now? And how do we sort of position it on the other side? What's the best way out of this? So I think social distancing will be around for ages, but you know, you probably presumably open some more things that they've shut, particularly in the service sector. So the reason that you get hit hard in these things is Australia and most of these developed economies, about 70% services, and that's the sector that you close down. And so that's the sort of impact that you get there.
Well, it's good to hear some cautious optimism.
Yeah, but the honest answer is we don't know. We really don't know.
No, of course. And I suppose we've talked internationally, but let's move back on shore. You know, we as a country don't have a lot of debt, but per capita we have some of the highest household debt going around.
Oh, yeah.
How do you think that's going to impact our recovery?
It's going to mean that people are going to be more scared to take up debt. We have high levels of private sector debt to GDP, but also, which is fine, but that's not the same as saying that you've got so much debt, you're Greece. It's not true. Australia has a lot of assets. And one of the examples that we're picking up now is on average, averages are difficult, but on average, the Australian consumer in a variable home loan is about 3 years ahead of where they need to. So one of the interesting things we're seeing at present is we're seeing a lot of applications for, I don't want to pay up any debt for the next 6 months. And then we look at the guy's loan and we say, well, actually you're 12 months ahead. So, but there'll be some other people that have lost their jobs and they've just bought a house and the house is worth nothing now and blah, blah, blah. And their business is gone. So my sort of thing is the debt thing is way overbuilt, way over sort of positioned. So Australia, and I think I've said to Kate, you in the past, if you add up the net debt, in other words, assets against the debt, Australia's the second best in the world behind Japan. So we've got a structural situation that you're exposed to liquidity crunches, and that's what we've got. And normally something like an 8% unemployment rate will kill you in the home loan. But I think the banks are going to be much more forgiving, at least for 6 months, to see how we're going. Because to put anyone into what we call SBS, which is into the bad debt area or bad bank part, unless you really absolutely have to. And if customers are good going into this, the banks are going to look through this.
Yeah, and we know that, Ellen. You know, Greg's already been talking about how many customers we've been actively working to support over the last month, and we'll continue to do that. We're answering the questions as they come through here. We've also had a couple of questions around the residential investment property market and how you might be seeing that play out. Tell us your thoughts on that, Ellen.
Okay, so again, we're guessing, but we would expect, given the slowdown in the population growth, and given that we've got unemployment
around 8, well, above 8 and then around 8 for a while, we would expect to see house prices fall somewhere 10 to 15%. Let's assume it's 15 and let's assume it's into the March quarter next year, so you're 3 to 4 each time. After that, we'd see it flattening out a bit. But I would expect house prices in most places to be under pressure, particularly as it goes along. But again, if the virus is over quicker, then people will sort of come out the other side. And I'm told by my daughter, who's currently trying to buy a house, that there's a lot of first-time owners who are cashed up and sitting around for a couple of months waiting to sort of extract some pain. So I suspect it's going to come back down, but it's not going to crash 30, 40, 50%.
Optimistic. Now, here's a question we've had through that's a bit close to my heart as the customer executive for NAB Health. Do you see a sustained revival in manufacturing in Australia, in particular medical equipment, medical supplies and medicines? How are you feeling about that?
Okay, so if I'm looking from the outside, I must admit I've been shocked to hear that, 80% of our medicines come from China and we can't build ventilators. So, and the economic argument has always been, well, it's cheaper to buy them out of China and they'll always be there for us, so don't worry about it. And if that was the case, there's a good economic argument for that. But if you suddenly see China's not giving the ventilators that they should have been, then I would have thought on national security grounds, you sort of say, well, hang on, I need a few things, particularly in the health area, that we can manufacture this stuff. Or we can manufacture, if one of our bright things in the universities discover a virus antidote, we need to be able to manufacture that. My understanding is outside of CSL, there's not many. And so I would expect to see that as an area that Australia would like to or should think seriously about, saying, hang on, in free trade, we want an exemption from that one. We want to build our own stuff because we've been taught a lesson in this virus that if China decides they want all their stuff, they're just not going to send it to us. And so I think that's probably one area where you would expect to see a structural benefit in the medium term for local production.
And we have had some other questions, with the rise of protectionism and the shutting of borders, what other sectors or industries do you see that might suffer or might benefit from that?
Well, just at present, everything's suffering is the honest answer. You're clearly going to see population slow down. Anything that's relying on, education. People can now all doing it by Zoom. Depending on the price, can I get for the same price a degree out of Harvard as what I can get out of Melbourne Uni? That's going to be an interesting dynamic. Anything that was, if you've got a shop in an airport, I think you already know the result. But anything's relying on foreigners, so education, tourism. So, one of the hard hits areas that nobody talks about are places like Cairns. There's nobody coming. And now they've closed down the border, so you can only have Brisbane people or Queenslanders coming. So those things, I think, are going to be fundamentally affected for longer than the local stuff would probably be my sort of short answer to that.
Thanks. And then I suppose one final question. How are you feeling about this access to super, how people might start, how the super funds and the role they might play in recovery?
Yeah, well, to give you a perspective, I was on a phone call last night talking to MLC, and they claim that on the tax office website, they track the number of applications, and it's something like 30% of all super annuitants are basically put a claim in to get 10 grand out. I actually don't like that, particularly in a lifestyle hypothesis sort of thing. You're putting your money away so that you can retire and have a decent retirement. And it might sound good now, but it'll be hard to get it back up to where you were. So that's one I really personally don't like, but the government's already done it. And it will also cause some grief for some of those super funds, particularly the small ones, because what they all got to do is have cash. And if they don't have cash, because people want the cash back. So if you have your money as a super fund tied up on, say, infrastructure, which is great, really good, but you can't necessarily sell the infrastructure straight away. And so I would suspect that parts of the small super funds are in serious trouble at present. But yeah, and maybe part of the getting back cash is selling equities, which also hurts other people.
Exactly, flow on effect.
I don't like that policy, but one that's been done.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Alan. I suppose we've got one last question here, which I might take before I move to close. We've got a question about whether NAB stopped lending for new business. And I think that, you know, whether NAB has stopped lending for new business, Alan.
Oh, no. Well, you're doing too many Zoom messages, but we actually think business credit, based on what we're seeing in people drawing down their loans and taking up the new 250,000 and drawing down loans in the business bank rather than just the top end, we could see in the next 6 months, $25 billion of additional credit demand on our book of 100 bill. And so, you know, the credit numbers I've got at present for business credit is up 15% over the course of this year, most of which is occurring from now on, and 7 or 8% in your average terms, whereas deposits are not doing that. But from a bank's point of view, it's not really that useful because we're not getting any interest. But I think, as I say, it's the shock absorber. That you've got to have a shock absorber, otherwise it's really difficult. And that's the role that hopefully the banks after the Royal Commission can redeem themselves a little bit.
Totally. And I think it is important to remind everyone that we're still open for business. We're working really hard to support our customers during this challenging time. So thank you to everyone who asked questions and sent them through. We've had a lot of them. We haven't had a chance to get to all of them. But I'd like to remind you that Alan's now doing twice weekly podcasts and we're publishing other valuable insights. So please go to business.nab.com.au if you want to have a listen to Alan twice a week. I think it's really important to remember that we're here to help in these extremely challenging times. And if you want details about our relief packages, go to nab.com.au/coronavirus. I think the other thing that I really wanted to say, and we've touched on this, you know, there's optimism, but there's also a lot of panic and distress out there in the community. And a lot of people are under mental stress that they've never experienced before. It could be patients, your customers if you're on your business, but it can also be you yourself. NAB's currently offering free coaching and support with our wellbeing provider Benestar, and you can have a 3-hour session for them at no cost via phone or Skype. And so please do feel free to call 1300 360 364, which you can see on your screens there, and make sure that you mention the NAB Village Wellbeing Support Program, and then you'll be able to get some support if you just like someone else to talk to. So finally, thank you specifically and specially to our health customers that are on the front line of the fight that we all face at the moment. But thank you to all of you for your participation and questions on the call. Thank you so much to Alan for taking the time to speak to us. We hope the webinar has been informative, and we'd love you to keep an eye out for a survey we're going to send you all to get your feedback. Please do remember NAB and its people are here to support you during these challenging times. We will get through this, all of us together, having conversations, sharing information like we have done today. So thank you again, everyone, for making time to join us. Take care of yourselves, stay safe, and make sure, of course, that you stay well. Thank you.
Thanks.